Hello and welcome to another daily update from the Wildlife Trust at COP26. And you don't want to miss today's episode because it could well be the final day of negotiations, but we are hearing they might drag into Saturday and possibly even Sunday. We've got a great episode coming up for you with an interview from Dr. Emily Shukra on what COP all means in terms of the climate science. We've got an interview with Deborah Meaden looking at business and trade. But first, we're going to hear from Craig on what's been happening over the last 24 hours as we've had a new draft text published in the first hours of this morning. So does this draft text reflect the mood of the conference hall or perhaps reflect the pretty miserable weather here in Glasgow?
Thank you, Elliot. Yes, well, it's tense here in Glasgow on the last scheduled day of the negotiations. A new text came out from the UK presidency this morning, and we at the Wildlife Trust and others have been looking at it very carefully to try and understand exactly where we might be landing at the end of these negotiations, whenever they do end. If you think about how Boris Johnson and Alok Sharma said that COP26 was all about trying to keep 1.5 alive. In other words, trying to make sure we saw the commitments that would give us confidence we could keep global temperature rises to just 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Well, I would say we've seen some useful interventions over the last couple of weeks that have all been kind of helpful, but they haven't yet changed the prognosis for 1.5. The challenges have always been really about the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. Are countries of the world coming up with strong enough pledges to cut their carbon emissions in time to keep 1.5 alive? And we've just not seen enough there from all countries together. There's just not enough pledges on the table that are strong enough. So all countries, but particularly, of course, the rich industrialised world, are going to have to up their commitments to cut carbon emissions over the next few months before they come together again, if we're going to keep 1.5 alive. But also crucially on finance. This has been one of the most toxic issues at these talks because we've just not seen the rich world deliver on promises it made in 2009 at the Copenhagen climate talks to mobilise $100 billion of climate finance every year for the most climate vulnerable countries, in other words, the poorest countries. And it is really shameful that the rich world has not managed to do that by now, so many years later on. It's currently got to around 80 billion. But to put that in perspective, that's so $20 billion short. That is about half the cost of the UK road building programme. So what you're not seeing at the moment are the rich countries giving this nearly enough priority that's needed to unlock the kind of diplomacy to really kind of build that momentum that is needed for us to get to 1.5 degrees and keep temperature rises at that. And then if we go back to cutting carbon emissions here in the UK, yes, we've seen some useful policies from the UK government over the last couple of years on this, but again, it's not nearly enough. And unfortunately, we still see things pointing in the wrong direction. I mean, it's absolute madness that in the UK, and Boris Johnson is looking to commit to the Cambo oil field, a whole new oil field in the seas around the UK that would just lock us in to yet more oil and gas production in the years ahead, when we need to be coming off the hook of fossil fuels as fast as possible. When you look at our agricultural transition here in the UK, there is a wonderful opportunity there to make sure that we have payments for farmers and landowners that really support nature-based solutions that will help us tackle the climate crisis, both through drawing carbon down, but also helping us adapt to climate crisis. And we're not seeing, we don't think at the Wildlife Trust, anything quite like the real efforts needed on that to deliver an agricultural transition that will do what's needed. And we need to see so much more effort around energy efficiency, more energy efficient products and so on. There is so much more we could and should be doing to tackle the climate and nature emergency. And the only real measure of progress on this is not whether we're doing a little bit more than we've done in the past, is are we doing enough to keep us at 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels and to make sure that we can adapt to the climate change already locked in. That's the only comparison that really matters, and on that we're not doing enough. So I'm delighted for us now to be joined by Dr. Emily Shukra renowned climate scientist and communicator, director of Cambridge Zero, and also, crucially, a friend of COP26. So in other words, someone who's there to help the UK presidency try and smooth through and make sure the COP is productive. So Emily, thanks so much for joining us today. Emily, just remind us that this whole COP has been framed around the need to try and keep 1.5 alive. Why is that important?
Oh, listener, it's critically important. We've already seen the impacts of climate change affecting lives and livelihoods around the world. Last few months, wildfires, floods, storm damage, really devastating communities. And that's when we're at 1.1 or so degrees of warming. As we edge up towards 1.5, and worse still if we get above 1.5 degrees, then we will start to be in a world that we just do not recognise. We know that as you move between 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming, we risk hundreds of millions of additional people being exposed to the impacts of climate change and poverty. And in terms of the natural world, it's literally the difference between extinction or not just of species, but of entire ecosystems. At 2 degrees, we may have no coral reefs left on the world. That's what it means.
And so it's very worrying. I mean, are we on track yet or anywhere close to trying to keep global temperatures to 1.5?
I wish I could say yes, but the answer is no, we're not. The pledges that are being put forward this week from countries around the world are simply not sufficient. We needed to be halving global emissions by 2030, and the pledges are not even doing a fraction of that. So it's welcome that we've started to see a direction of travel, not just from countries, but in terms of the businesses of the world as well, towards net zero. But that trajectory is not happening fast enough.
Now, so much of the focus of this COP26 has been on net zero and the need to try and have a focus on that for both companies and governments likewise. It's almost been talked about as if it's a destination, but is that correct?
No, it's absolutely not. This is the scale of the challenge, is that not only do we need to be reaching net zero by around about the middle of the century in terms of our global emissions, but any of the trajectories that take us to a world that keeps temperatures below 1.5 degrees with a reasonable chance, they go below zero afterwards. So we need to be actually taking carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. We've already put too much into the atmosphere. Now, the good news is that not only do we have technologies that are being developed in order to do that, but we have nature which does it for us in any case. So if only we could be looking to better support, protect and indeed restore our natural worlds, then we restore the natural life systems that do precisely some of the things that we need to do. Now, none of that can be at the expense of really rapid emissions reductions, but nature can be helping us here if only we looked to actually treat it with the respect it deserves.
And you and I have both been to many COPs over the years and followed this issue for a long time. You know, a huge frustration I've long had, I know you as well, is that for too long the climate and nature issues are being talked about as if they're separate issues somehow. It feels to me, for the first time, you know, there's a lot more join up between those issues here. And this feels to me like it's been a COP26 has had more discussion about nature than any previous COP. Do you think we're finally getting there and people realising how closely these issues are linked?
Oh no, I think you're absolutely right. Nature has been absolutely central to this COP in so many different ways, and rightly so, because not only can nature help us in terms of those emissions reductions, it also helps provide resilience to so many of the impacts of climate change, whether that's in terms of flood defences or other protective systems of the natural world. So it is absolutely central, and it's absolutely essential that as our nature is under threat, that we look at ways of both protecting nature and of addressing the climate challenge.
Well, that's a message that the Wildlife Trust will strongly agree with for sure. Dr. Emily Shukra, thank you so much for speaking to the Wildlife Trust today.
What an amazing interview there from Dr. Emily Shukra on what this all means in terms of the climate science. We're now going to speak to Deborah Meaden, who's going to look at what it means for business and also for the UK's trade negotiations.
So I'm delighted now to be joined by Deborah Meaden, who will need no introduction for you as such a wonderful leading businesswoman and, of course, one of the famous Dragon Dens. Deborah, you've been here at COP26 these last few days. What have you made of it?
Well, I feel very honoured to be here because it's discussing the most important topic of our lifetime. And I've heard a lot of really, really good stuff. I guess the question is, what actually happens next? Because there's some great initiatives, there's some wonderful pledges being made, but we don't have an awful lot of time, so we shouldn't really be talking about 10, 20, 30, 40 years. You know, by the end of next year, I'd like to see that some of this has already hit home.
As a businesswoman, of course, perhaps one of the most famous businesswomen in the UK, interesting to get your thoughts on what George Eustice has said this morning as Secretary of State for the Environment on the Andrew Marr programme, when he was pushed about how to make some of these commitments made at COP stick, and particularly around trade deals, and do we need to bring in trade tariffs to try to make these stick? What's your thought on that?
Well, that's one of the hardest and one of the easiest ways to show that actually what we're talking about here at COP is real and is actually going to happen, because actually immediately making a statement to embed some of these pledges and some of these promises that have been made into trade deals means that it starts happening now. So that's difficult. Trade deals are never easy anyway, but they aren't easy. But that doesn't mean to say that we should stop making the changes that we need to make.
So we should make sure that all the promises that have been made here this week are absolutely hardwired into all future trade deals, and perhaps even retrospectively into old ones.
Absolutely, and that will be the clearest indicator that this COP, that COP26, is different to the others.
And finally, we've got 870,000 supporters of the wildlife trusts across the UK and in the Isle of Man and Alderney. What would you like to say to them?
I would like to say that you are supporting probably the most important thing we can do in the UK. We need to live alongside we need to learn to live alongside our wildlife, and you offer us a framework to do that.
Deborah Meaden, thanks so much for speaking to the Wildlife Trust here at COP26. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it from us at the Wildlife Trust at what is really crunch time in the negotiations. No one knows how long this thing is going to drag on, but join us for tomorrow, where we will have another daily update for you.